Artists, today we are going to be drawing a jar. We're going to start with a Sharpie and white paper. The reason why we're starting with a Sharpie and not a pencil is because sometimes if we draw with a pencil, we focus too much on erasing things that we think are mistakes. But a good artist just turns something that they think is a mistake into something that works. So we're going to start with a half piece of paper, and our jar, we want to take up most of the size of this paper. So when we start our drawing, notice that I'm starting towards the top so that I get a nice big jar. We're going to start with something called an ellipse. An ellipse is like an oval that is kind of squished together. So the ellipse is going to be the top of our jar. Now notice that I did not make my ellipse as wide as the paper because the lid of the jar is going to be smaller than the sides of the jar. So I'm starting with an ellipse at the top. The next thing that I want to do is I want to just draw two straight lines down right from the edge of my ellipse. Remember, we are making the lid of our jar. To connect these, I don't want to make a straight line because that would make my jar look kind of flat and not three-dimensional. So I want to kind of follow the curve that I created on the ellipse, just like that. So now I've got the lid of the jar. If you know what a mason jar or a glass jar with a lid looks like, you'll know that sometimes they have another little lip on the lid. So I'm just going to kind of give myself one more little curve right on the bottom of the lid that we've just created. Now we know that a jar usually doesn't go straight down. Usually the jar has what we call a neck. So to give this jar a neck, I am going to start right at the top. And I'm going to give it a curved line. And I'm going to repeat the curved line on the opposite side, but I need it to be facing the opposite direction. So this curve faces out to the left, this curve faces out to the right. Now I need to make the body of the jar, and I can start by doing a straight line down. The straight line is going to be this side. If I want to give it a little bit of a curve here to help me make it look more three-dimensional, I will. So I'm going to curve down. I'm going to repeat the same on the right side. So I'm going to curve down. Now the bottom here, once again, we do not want to do a straight line. Whoops, a straight line is not going to make our ball jar look exactly three-dimensional. So we want to give it a curved line. And notice that I made a mistake and I'm okay with it. I think I can make it work. So I'm going to give myself a curved line to close off my jar. Now so far we are almost done, but there's one more thing that we can do that can help make our jar look a little bit more three-dimensional. If this is a glass jar and if we can see through this jar, we should give ourselves one more little curved line inside the jar. It doesn't have to connect to anything, and that's going to make it look like our jar is see-through. We can go back into the lid of our jar and we can add some vertical lines to help us make it look like it is a lid that screws on. The next step that we're going to do is we're going to take an overhead transparency. This is like a clear piece of paper that's kind of thick, and we are actually going to lay this right on top of our jar that we just drew, and we are going to trace right on top of that overhead transparency using our Sharpie. So I'm tracing all of the lines that we've just drawn. I'm aiming for my best, taking my time. And if it doesn't trace exactly, that's fine. If we move it, we've got to make sure that they stay in place because we don't want our tracer to get crooked. So I want to try our best to keep it in place. I'm following the steps in the order that I did because I think it will be easier to remember how to draw the jar. If it's not perfect, that's okay. We now have two jars, one on paper and one with an overhead transparency. Our next step is to actually cut out this overhead transparency jar. So I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm just following the outline. I don't want to cut into the jar. This is just a line to help us make it look like it's three-dimensional. So I'm going to aim for my best and I'm going to use my scissors to cut right along the outline of our jar. Now that my jar is cut out, I'm ready for my next step. I'm going to have a black piece of paper, and anywhere on your black piece of paper, I want you to put your jar. Eventually, we're going to be doing some fun stuff to this black piece of paper and drawing some fireflies that are inside of our jar. So we need to find a spot that we like our jar. I think I like mine on an angle, maybe kind of right here. Once you have your jar in the place that you want, you're going to use a white crayon and just trace your overhead transparency like a stencil. Just aim for your best. We just need an outline of our jar to help us know where our fireflies and where our background need to go. Once your jar is outlined, I want you to write your name and your code on the back of your paper. And we are going to use all three of these pieces of paper that we've started today when we get ready to do our next project. So if you need to write your name on your jar, try to do it real small with Sharpie in the corner. We don't want it to be too big. We don't want to distract from the rest of our jar. And you can also write it on your white piece of paper. We're going to be using this for some practice drawing.